Penelope Bloomville was her family's embarrassment. Too bookish, too clumsy, too honest. When she spilled wine on the reclusive Earl of Thornfield, she expected fury. Instead, he saw what no one else did, her brilliance. 3 weeks later, he returned to society with one mission: to make everyone see her worth.
Hello everyone! Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, like the video and share with loved ones, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin.
Must you always have your nose in a book, Penelope? Lucinda's voice was silk over steel as she adjusted her perfect coiffure in the mirror. The Harrington musicale is tonight, and you look like a governess. Again. Penelope Bloomville, 21 years old and perpetually disappointing, glanced up from her Greek text. Her sister stood resplendent in rose silk, every curl arranged to perfection, every gesture calculated for maximum effect. "I thought I wasn't attending," Penelope said carefully. "Mother insists." Lucinda's lip curled. Though heaven knows why, the Earl of Thornfield will be there. His first appearance since his wife's death 2 years ago. "We cannot afford one of your incidents." The Bloomville townhouse in Russell Square had seen better days. Their father's death 5 years prior had left them with a modest income that required careful management, or more accurately, required Lucinda to marry brilliantly and save them all. Lady Bloomville, their widowed mother, had poured all resources into launching Lucinda into society. At 24, Lucinda had perfected the art of charming conversation, graceful dancing, and strategic positioning near eligible gentlemen. She was, by every measure, a success. Penelope was, by every measure, a failure. She read Greek and Latin. She quoted obscure poets at inappropriate moments. She possessed the unfortunate habit of speaking her actual thoughts rather than decorative nothings. Her mother called it unfortunate frankness. Lucinda called it social suicide. Penelope called it exhausting. "Nobody likes you, Penny," Lucinda said, not for the first time as she fastened pearl bound earrings. "Why pretend otherwise? You'd be happier staying home with your dusty books." The words stung because they were true. Penelope had spent years watching from ballroom corners, overhearing whispers about the peculiar Bloomville daughter, enduring her mother's resigned disappointment. "Then why must I attend tonight?" "Because the Harringtons specifically invited our entire family, and refusing would be noticed." Lucinda turned from the mirror. "Just stay quiet, stay invisible, and for God's sake, don't lecture anyone about poetry." That evening, squeezed into a gown Lucinda had declared adequate at best, Penelope climbed into the carriage beside her mother and sister. Lady Bloomville's instructions were brief and familiar. Do not draw attention. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not embarrass your sister. The Harrington residence blazed with candlelight, filled with London's finest society. Penelope watched Lucinda glide into the crowd, immediately surrounded by admirers, her laughter musical and perfectly timed. "Your sister knows how to conduct herself," Lady Bloomville murmured. "If only you'd apply yourself to learning such skills instead of reading books no lady needs." Penelope had stopped arguing years ago. She tried once to explain that reading wasn't a choice but a necessity, that books were the only place she felt understood, where intelligence wasn't a liability. Her mother hadn't understood then. She wouldn't understand now. As the musicale began, Penelope edged toward the library. No one would miss her. No one ever did. The library was blissfully empty, lined with books that promised escape. She approached the poetry section, scanning titles with relief. Here, at least, she belonged. Her fingers found a slim volume, Wordsworth's Lyrical Ballads, 1802 edition. rare and beautiful. She reached for it eagerly. Her elbow connected with something on the side table. Time slowed as a wine glass tipped, red liquid arcing through the air, in a perfect, damning trajectory, directly onto the pristine white waistcoat of the man standing behind her, the Earl of Thornfield. Penelope's world collapsed into a single, horrified realization. She'd just ruined the evening's most important guest, and confirmed once again that Lucinda was right. Nobody liked her, and now she'd given them one more reason why. "I'm so terribly sorry, my lord. There's no excuse. I'm dreadfully clumsy," and Penelope was babbling. She knew it but couldn't stop. Her hands fluttered uselessly as red wine soaked into the Earl's expensive clothing. This was disaster. Complete, utter disaster. Lucinda would never forgive her. Mother would be mortified. They'd probably be banned from society entirely. The Earl raised one hand and she fell silent. "You were reaching for Wordsworth's lyrical ballads," he said quietly, his dark eyes studying her face rather than his ruined waistcoat. "The 1802 edition, if I'm not mistaken. Few people under 40 know that collection exists." Penelope blinked, completely disoriented. He wasn't shouting, wasn't summoning servants to have her removed. He was discussing poetry. Julian Blackwood, Earl of Thornfield, was 32 and looked older. Grief had carved lines around his eyes and mouth that shouldn't exist on a man his age. His wife Eleanor had died 2 years ago from consumption, and he'd withdrawn completely from society. Tonight was his first appearance since her funeral, and Penelope had just drenched him in wine. "Most people find Wordsworth tedious," Penelope ventured carefully, still braced for anger. "Most people," Julian replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Fine thinking tedious. I suspect you are not most people, Miss Bloomville." He knew her name. How did he know her name? "You look surprised," Julian observed, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbing ineffectually at the wine stain. "Your sister introduced us last season. Though you were positioned so far behind your mother, I doubt you noticed." Penelope's cheeks burned. Of course, Lucinda had monopolized his attention while Penelope stood invisible in the background. "As always. I apologize again for the wine, my lord. Your waistcoat is ruined." "I have others." He gestured to the book she'd been reaching for. "Do you read Wordsworth often?" The question caught her off guard. No one asked about her reading. Ever. "Yes, particularly his reflections on nature and memory, the way he explores how landscape shapes us, how places hold echoes of who we were." She stopped herself. "I'm sorry, you don't want a lecture." "On the contrary," Julian's voice was sincere. "It's been 2 years since anyone spoke to me about something other than condolences or business matters. A lecture on Wordsworth sounds remarkably refreshing." For 20 minutes they talked, not the practiced small talk of ballrooms, but real conversation, about poetry's ability to capture grief, about living authentically versus performing acceptability, about the courage required to be honest in a world that valued polish over substance. Julian revealed that Eleanor had loved poetry, that after she died, everyone wanted him to grieve in measured, appropriate ways. They wanted me to perform grief as social theater. Your sister, I imagine, would excel at such performance. But you, I suspect you would simply be honest. Honesty hasn't served me well in society, my lord. Then society is the problem, not your honesty. The simple statement hit Penelope like a revelation. For years, she'd been told she was wrong, too bookish, too earnest, too much. But Julian spoke as if her authenticity was valuable, not defective. "May I ask," Julian said, "why you're hiding in the library when there's a musicale in progress?" "Because I'm better with books than people. Books don't judge you for saying the wrong thing or being too interested in ideas. Neither do I. His dark eyes held hers. In fact, I find people who care about ideas infinitely preferable to people who care only about appearances. Penelope felt something dangerous bloom in her chest, hope that someone finally saw her as something other than a disappointment. Then Lucinda's voice shattered the moment. Lord Thornfield, there you are. Mother and I have been searching everywhere. Lucinda swept into the library, followed closely by Lady Bloomville. Both women's eyes went wide, seeing Penelope alone with the Earl, his waistcoat obviously stained. What happened? Lady Bloomville demanded. A small accident, Julian said smoothly. Nothing of consequence. But Lucinda had already assessed the situation. Penelope, the Earl, obvious disaster. Her smile was practiced perfection as she positioned herself between them. I must apologize for my sister monopolizing your time with her tedious lectures, my lord. She forgets not everyone shares her peculiar enthusiasms. Lucinda's hand rested lightly on Julian's arm, her touch practiced and possessive. You've been far too kind, Lord Thornfield, but I really must rescue you. The musicale is about to resume, and I know Mother was hoping you might join us. Lady Bloomville stepped forward, her smile tight. Indeed, Your Grace. We're seated in the second row, an excellent view. Penelope, you'll return home with the carriage. Clearly you're unwell. It wasn't a suggestion. Julian glanced at Penelope, something like protest forming on his lips, but social convention held him captive. A gentleman couldn't refuse a lady's mother without causing offense, and Lucinda had positioned herself so expertly that extracting himself would require awkward maneuvering. Miss Bloomville, he said, his voice carrying regret, thank you for the conversation. It was, come, my lord, Lucinda interrupted smoothly, already guiding him toward the door. You simply must hear the soprano. She's trained in Milan. Penelope stood frozen as they swept Julian away. Her mother paused only to hiss in her ear. Wine on the Earl. Do you have any idea how this looks? You've embarrassed us. Again. Then she was gone, following Lucinda and Julian back to the musicale, leaving Penelope alone among the books that had promised refuge but delivered only humiliation. She should leave. The carriage would return for her, but the thought of facing the driver's knowing look, of arriving home to wait for her mother's longer lecture, was unbearable. Instead, she drifted toward the refreshment room, keeping to the shadows, practiced at invisibility. That's when she heard Lucinda's voice, bright and carrying from the adjacent corridor. Far too polite to tell her, of course, but honestly, nobody likes a blue stocking who can't even hold a wine glass properly. Female laughter followed. Penelope pressed herself against the wall, suddenly cold. Poor thing doesn't realize she's a joke of every drawing room. Another voice added, Miss Caroline Hartwell, one of Lucinda's usual companions. Can you imagine, Lucinda continued, trapping the Earl in the library, lecturing him about dead poets? Mother and I spent half our energy containing her peculiarities. If she'd just accept that nobody wants her at these events, at least she's useful as a warning, Miss Hartwell said. That's what happens when girls are allowed to read too much. More laughter, cruel and casual. Penelope stood frozen, the words confirming every fear she'd carried for 21 years. She was the joke, the warning, the embarrassment her family tolerated but didn't value. She didn't cry. Tears would accomplish nothing. Instead, she straightened her spine, swallowed the pain, and walked quietly toward the terrace doors. What she didn't see was Julian Blackwood standing in the corridor's other entrance, having extricated himself from Lucinda under the pretense of needing air. He'd been searching for Penelope to continue their conversation, to ask if he might call on her. Instead, he heard everything. He watched Penelope's shoulders curve inward, watched her blink rapidly as she absorbed her sister's cruelty, watched her quiet exit through the terrace doors, not dramatic collapse, just dignified defeat. Something cold and furious settled in Julian's chest. This wasn't sibling rivalry. This was systematic destruction of a young woman whose only crime was being genuine in a world that valued performance. He'd been that genuine once before society taught him to hide. Eleanor had loved him for it. After she died, he'd buried that part of himself because being authentic meant being vulnerable, and vulnerability led to unbearable pain. But watching Penelope walk away, accepting this cruelty as if she deserved it, Julian made a decision. She didn't deserve this, and he was going to make certain everyone knew it. But first, and this part made him quietly furious with himself, he needed to withdraw, to plan, to approach this strategically. Rushing in now would only make things worse for her. So he left the Harrington musicale, his wine-stained waistcoat a reminder of the most honest conversation he'd had in 2 years, and the woman his society had decided wasn't worth knowing. They were wrong, and he would prove it. But Penelope, walking home alone through London streets, didn't know any of this. She only knew that the brief hope she'd felt in the library had been crushed, and that Lucinda was right. Nobody liked her, not even the Earl who'd seemed different. He'd let them take him away without a word. What happens next will shock everyone, because Julian Blackwood doesn't forget. And when an Earl decides to wage war on society's cruelty, he does it with devastating precision. Subscribe now to see how he transforms Penelope from family embarrassment to the most sought-after woman in London. One calculated appearance at a time. Julian Blackwood disappeared from society the day after the Harrington musicale. No explanations, no apologies, just absence. For Penelope, his silence confirmed everything she'd feared. She'd embarrassed him with the wine spill, trapped him with tedious lectures, and he'd fled back to his self-imposed isolation. The 20 minutes of genuine conversation had been kindness, nothing more, a gentleman too polite to tell her what everyone else already knew. She was unlikable, even to someone who'd seemed different. Lucinda wasted no time capitalizing on Penelope's humiliation. "After your display with the Earl," she announced the morning after the musicale, examining her reflection with satisfaction, "Mother and I agree you shouldn't attend the Pemberton ball." Penelope looked up from her breakfast, a familiar dread settling in her stomach. But Lady Pemberton invited our family, not you specifically." Lucinda's smile was sharp. "Think about it, Penny. The Earl fled London the day after meeting you. What does that tell you?" It told Penelope exactly what she'd always known, but had briefly, foolishly allowed herself to doubt. The restrictions came gradually but relentlessly. The Sutherland soiree? Too intimate. We can't risk your peculiar comments. Lady Westmont's musicale? The Earl might attend. You've already humiliated us once. Mrs. Henderson's literary salon? Especially not that one. You'll monopolize conversations and drive everyone away. Penelope found herself increasingly confined to the townhouse, allowed only at events deemed low risk, meaning events where no one important would notice her anyway. She watched from her bedroom window as Lucinda prepared for balls, her mother fussing over every detail of her appearance, discussing strategy for capturing Lord Ashford's attention or securing an invitation to the Duchess of Somerset's exclusive garden party. "Why torment yourself watching?" Lucinda asked one evening, catching Penelope at the window. Her voice carried something almost like pity, which was somehow worse than cruelty. "Nobody wants you there, Penny. You must know that by now." Penelope retreated to her room, to her books, to the small world where she still had value. But even reading brought no comfort. Every poem about connection reminded her of Julian's questions. Every philosophical text recalled their conversation about living authentically. She'd had one genuine conversation in her entire life, and she'd managed to ruin even that. Lady Bloomville's resignation was perhaps the cruelest blow. She found Penelope in the library one afternoon, surrounded by Greek texts. "I had hoped you might outgrow this phase," her mother said, sinking into a chair with visible exhaustion. "That you'd learn to be more like your sister, charming, appropriate, likable. But it seems you're determined to remain peculiar." "I'm not trying to be difficult, Mother. That's what makes it so hopeless. You don't even realize you're doing it." Lady Bloomville stood, smoothing her skirts. "Lucinda has prospects now. Lord Ashford seems genuinely interested. When she marries, perhaps you can serve as governess to her children. At least your education would be useful for something." After her mother left, Penelope sat in the gathering darkness, not bothering to light candles. The hope that had flickered during that library conversation guttered completely, leaving only cold acceptance. She was 21 years old, too educated for comfort, too honest for social success, too much herself to ever fit into the world her family inhabited. Julian Blackwood had been kind for 20 minutes. She should be grateful for that, rather than mourning what could never have been anything more. 3 weeks passed, 3 weeks of watching Lucinda prepare for events Penelope couldn't attend, 3 weeks of her mother's resigned disappointment, 3 weeks of accepting the truth Lucinda had always told her. Nobody liked her, and pretending otherwise was exhausting. She stopped pretending. On the night of the Pemberton Ball, an event she'd actually been invited to but forbidden from attending, Penelope sat in her room with a book she couldn't focus on, listening to her mother and sister's excited preparations echo through the townhouse. She didn't know that Julian Blackwood had specifically requested the guest list for that ball, that he'd confirmed Penelope's name was on it, that he was attending for one reason only. 3 weeks of absence hadn't been abandonment. It had been preparation. "Why must Penelope come?" Lucinda demanded, as Lady Bloomville pinned a final curl into place. "She'll only embarrass us, and Lord Ashford will be there." "Lady Pemberton asked after her specifically when I saw her at the modiste," Lady Bloomville replied, frowning. "It would be noticed if we left her home. But Penelope," she turned to where her younger daughter sat in the corner, "you will speak only when spoken to. You will not mention books, poetry, or anything remotely intellectual. You will be invisible. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, Mother." The Pemberton Ball glittered with London's finest. Penelope positioned herself near the wallpaper in the far corner of the ballroom. A practiced ghost. From here, she could observe without participating. Watch Lucinda charm Lord Ashford. Watch her mother calculate social maneuvers. Watch everyone else live lives she'd never be part of. She'd perfected invisibility. It was the only skill society valued from hers. Then the room's energy shifted. Conversations quieted. Heads turned toward the entrance. Mothers straightened, daughters preened, and a collective awareness rippled through the assembly. The Earl of Thornfield had arrived. Penelope's heart clenched painfully. She'd spent 3 weeks convincing herself she felt nothing, that 20 minutes of conversation meant nothing. Now, seeing him again, she knew she'd been lying. Julian stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in black evening clothes that emphasized his tall frame and the silver at his temples. He looked every inch the powerful earl, wealthy, titled, the most eligible widower in England. Lucinda smoothed her gown, confidence radiating from every practiced gesture. "He's here," she murmured to their mother. "This is my chance to..." But Julian wasn't looking at Lucinda. His dark eyes scanned the ballroom methodically, passing over eager debutantes, dismissing strategic positioning, searching for something specific. His gaze found Penelope, locked on her, and he moved. Not toward the center of the room where Lucinda waited, not toward the hostess to pay respects, directly toward the wallpaper corner where Penelope had tried to disappear. The crowd parted instinctively. Mothers stepped back. Daughters watched with dawning confusion. Lucinda's confident smile faltered. Julian crossed the entire ballroom, his focus never wavering, until he stood before Penelope. "Miss Bloomville," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I've been searching for you." Penelope couldn't breathe. "My lord, I acquired a copy of Collins's Ode to Evening," Julian continued, "and find myself in desperate need of your opinion on the translation in the third stanza. The word choice seems deliberately ambiguous, and I recalled your observations about Wordsworth's use of natural imagery. I believe Collins employs a similar technique, but I'd value your perspective." The ballroom had gone utterly silent. The Earl of Thornfield, reclusive, grieving, the most sought-after gentleman in London, had just publicly sought out the peculiar Bloomville daughter to discuss poetry. Penelope stared at him, unable to process what was happening. You want my opinion?" Desperately. A hint of warmth touched his eyes. "I've spent 3 weeks with the text and cannot make sense of the botanical references without consulting someone with your knowledge of natural philosophy." He was giving her value, publicly, deliberately. Around them, whispers erupted. Mothers who'd dismissed Penelope now studied her with new interest. Daughters who'd ignored her existence suddenly noticed. Lucinda stood frozen, her practiced charm useless in the face of Julian's unexpected choice. Penelope's voice shook. "I would be honored to discuss it, my lord." "Excellent," Julian offered his arm. "Shall we find somewhere quieter? The card room, perhaps? I have the volume with me." As Penelope placed her trembling hand on his arm, she caught Lucinda's expression, shock melting into fury, her sister finally understanding that something had shifted beyond her control. Julian led Penelope through the silent ballroom, every eye following them. He didn't acknowledge the stares, didn't explain, simply treated her as if seeking her intellectual opinion was the most natural thing in the world, which Penelope realized as they left the ballroom was exactly what he wanted everyone to see. This was an accident. This was strategy. The Earl of Thornfield had just made his first move in a campaign she didn't yet understand. But for the first time in 3 weeks, hope flickered back to life. Julian didn't stop at one appearance. Over the next 2 weeks, he attended more society events than he had in 2 years combined. And at every single one, he sought out Penelope with deliberate public intention. At Lady Westmont's musicale, he arrived during the interval and immediately located Penelope near the refreshments. He sat beside her for the second half, leaning close to discuss the musical structure, asking her opinion on the soprano's interpretation of Handel. "You have a trained ear," he said, loudly enough for nearby matrons to hear. "Most people hear only pleasant sounds. You understand composition." At the Somerset Gallery viewing, he spent an entire hour with Penelope analyzing paintings, quoting her earlier observations about perspective and light. When Lord Ashford attempted to join their conversation, Julian politely but firmly maintained focus on Penelope's insights. Miss Bloomville was explaining the symbolism in the background, fascinating interpretation I hadn't considered. Please continue. At Mrs. Henderson's literary salon, the event Penelope had been forbidden to attend until Lady Henderson specifically requested her presence, Julian arrived carrying a leather-bound first edition. "Miss Bloomville, I brought the Dawn collection we discussed. Would you read the marked passage aloud? Your interpretation would illuminate the text considerably. Each interaction was public, each was deliberate, each treated Penelope as the most interesting, valuable person in the room, and society noticed. Other gentlemen curious about what the Earl saw began engaging Penelope in conversation. Young Mr. Fletcher asked her opinion on Byronic poetry. Lord Thornbury requested her thoughts on Italian art. Even Lord Ashford, abandoning Lucinda mid-sentence, wondered if Miss Bloomville might recommend classical texts for his nephew. Mothers who'd previously dismissed her suddenly sought introductions. My daughter shares your love of literature, Miss Bloomville. Perhaps you might call on us? Invitations that had dried up after the Harrington musicale suddenly flooded the Bloomville townhouse, all specifically requesting Penelope's attendance. Lady Bloomville read them with stunned confusion. Lady Pemberton wants you at her card party. The Duchess of Somerset requests your presence at her garden viewing. Lucinda's fury built with each invitation, each gentleman's diverted attention, each event where she stood ignored while her unlikable sister became the center of attention. This is absurd, she hissed after the Somerset gallery, where she'd spent an hour watching Julian laugh at something Penelope said. He's making a fool of himself over a blue stocking who spilled wine on him. But Julian's strategy was working precisely as intended. By treating Penelope's intelligence as valuable, by publicly seeking her company, by demonstrating that the Earl of Thornfield, a man of impeccable taste and substantial influence, found her worthy of his time and attention, he was forcing society to reassess. If the Earl valued Miss Bloomville's opinions, perhaps she wasn't peculiar, perhaps she was discerning. If he found her conversation engaging, perhaps she wasn't tedious, perhaps she was brilliant. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Penelope went from family embarrassment to season's most intriguing companion, all because one person of consequence had decided she mattered. At the Hartwell afternoon tea, Penelope found herself surrounded by ladies eager to discuss literature, to ask about philosophy, to demonstrate they too appreciated intellectual conversation. I've always been interested in poetry, Miss Caroline Hartwell, who 3 weeks ago had laughed at Lucinda's mockery, now claimed with desperate sincerity. Penelope watched this reversal with something between wonder and bitter understanding. Nothing about her had changed. She was still bookish, still earnest, still herself, but Julian Blackwood had declared her valuable, and suddenly everyone else agreed. The arbitrariness of it should have been satisfying. Instead, it was quietly devastating. These same people had mocked her, excluded her, made her believe she was fundamentally unlikable. They hadn't been right then. They weren't right now. The only person whose opinion had ever mattered was Julian's, because he'd seen her when she was invisible, valued her when she was dismissed, and chosen her when she'd given up on being chosen. As she watched Lucinda's prospects dim, while her own brightened, not through any effort of her own, simply through Julian's strategic attention, Penelope realized something profound. Being liked by people who valued only performance was worthless. Being truly seen by one person who valued authenticity was everything. But Lucinda won't accept defeat quietly, and when she confronts Julian about wasting time on someone nobody likes, his response will destroy her entire worldview. Subscribe now, because what happens at Lady Westmont's ball will leave you breathless, and you won't want to miss the moment everything changes forever. Lucinda watched from across the ballroom as Julian laughed, actually laughed, at something Penelope said while examining a first edition at Lady Westmont's ball. The sound cut through her like broken glass. For 2 weeks she'd watched her carefully constructed world crumble. Invitations she'd cultivated for years now requested Penelope's presence, specifically. Gentlemen who'd once hung on her every word now asked if Miss Bloomville might be attending. Even Lord Ashford, her most devoted admirer, had wondered aloud whether Penelope might recommend reading material. The arbitrariness of it enraged her. Nothing about Penelope had changed. She was still awkward, still too earnest, still hopelessly unfashionable. Yet suddenly, inexplicably, the Earl of Thornfield had decided she mattered, and like sheep, everyone else had followed. Lucinda had spent her entire life perfecting the performance. The graceful walk, the calculated laughter, the precisely calibrated charm. She'd sacrificed authenticity for approval, studying what pleased people until she could deliver it flawlessly. And it had worked, until Julian Blackwood decided that Penelope's complete lack of performance was somehow preferable. She found him on the terrace during the interval, away from the crowd. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of roses from Lady Westmont's garden. Julian stood with his back to the ballroom, studying the stars with the same focused attention he gave everything. "My lord," Lucinda began, her voice perfectly modulated between concern and curiosity. "Might I speak with you privately?" He turned, his expression polite but guarded. "Miss Bloomville, Miss Lucinda Bloomville," she corrected with practiced sweetness. "I wanted to thank you for your kindness to my sister. Your attention has been unexpectedly generous." "There's nothing unexpected about it. Your sister is remarkable." Lucinda's smile tightened. The time for subtlety had passed. "My lord, forgive my directness, but I must ask, why waste your time on someone nobody likes?" Julian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Continue." The permission felt like danger, but Lucinda was too angry to stop. "Penelope is awkward. She has no polish, no grace. She speaks about philosophy when people want to discuss fashion. She quotes dead poets when people want pleasant conversation. She's peculiar, my lord. The family embarrassment. You could have anyone in London, accomplished women who know how to conduct themselves properly. Why her?" The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was quiet, precise, and absolutely devastating. "Then society's taste is as impoverished as I suspected." Lucinda blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Your sister," Julian continued, each word deliberate, "is the only person in London worth knowing. She's genuine in a world of performance, intelligent in a sea of vapidity. She possesses more substance in one honest sentence than most people manage in a lifetime of calculated charm. But she's kind," Julian interrupted, "despite being surrounded by cruelty, particularly yours." The words landed like physical blows. Lucinda felt her carefully constructed mask begin to crack. "The question, Miss Lucinda Bloomville, isn't why I choose her. The question is why you're so determined to destroy the only valuable thing your family possesses." "Valuable?" Lucinda's voice rose despite herself. "She's difficult. She's always been difficult." "No," Julian said, and his certainty was absolute. "She's not difficult. The rest of you are simply exhausting." He stepped past her, moving toward the ballroom. Then he paused, delivering one final observation without turning around. "You've spent your life perfecting performance while mocking her authenticity. Now you're angry because someone finally recognized which one has value. That's not her failure, that's yours." Lucinda stood alone on the terrace, watching him disappear into the crowd. For the first time in her life, she'd lost. And worse, she was beginning to understand she'd been losing all along. Julian didn't return to the terrace. Instead, he moved through the ballroom with singular purpose. scanning the crowd until he found Penelope near the library doors, half hidden behind a marble column, as if she might disappear into the walls themselves. She was watching the dancing with that expression he'd come to recognize, thoughtful, analytical, slightly removed. Not because she didn't want to participate, but because she'd learned that wanting things meant disappointment. Miss Bloomville, she turned, and the startled pleasure that crossed her face, quickly suppressed, as if happiness were something she wasn't allowed, made his chest tighten. "My lord, I thought you'd gone to take her on the terrace. I had a conversation that clarified certain matters." He extended his hand. "Walk with me." Penelope glanced around nervously. The ballroom was crowded, hundreds of eyes that might notice, might judge. What are you, here in front of everyone? Especially in front of everyone. She took his hand, and he led her not toward the edge in where wallflowers gathered, but directly through the center of the ballroom. Conversations stuttered and stopped. Dancers faltered. Every head turned to watch the Earl of Thornfield walking the peculiar Bloomville daughter through the heart of Lady Westmont's ball. He stopped in the center of the room, beneath the massive chandelier where everyone could see them clearly. The musicians, sensing something significant, let the current dance end without beginning another. The silence was absolute. Penelope's hand trembled in his. "Julian, what are you—" "I have a question," he said, loudly enough for nearby observers to hear, "that requires your legendary honesty." Her eyes widened. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, curious, scandalized, riveted. "3 weeks ago," Julian continued, his voice steady and clear, "I attended my first social event in 2 years. I went because duty demanded it, expecting nothing but tedious performance. Then a woman spilled wine on me while reaching for Wordsworth, and everything changed." Penelope's breath caught. Across the room he could see Lady Bloomville frozen in shock, Lucinda pale with dawning horror. She defended poetry with passion. She spoke honestly about loss when everyone else offered empty platitudes. She showed me that joy wasn't dead. I'd simply been surrounded by people incapable of recognizing authenticity. "My lord," Penelope whispered, tears gathering in her eyes, "please, you don't have to." "I do." He took both her hands now, anchoring her when she looked ready to flee. "For 3 weeks, I watched society dismiss the most remarkable person I've ever met. I watched your own family treat brilliance as liability, intelligence as embarrassment. I watched you accept their judgment as truth." The ballroom was so quiet he could hear the candles flickering in the chandelier above. "So I'm asking you now, in front of everyone, so there can be no doubt, no misunderstanding, no possibility of you believing this is anything less than absolute certainty." He took a breath. "Penelope Bloomville, will you marry me?" Her tears spilled over. "You want to marry me, even though nobody likes me?" The brokenness in her voice, the genuine belief that she was unlikable, made him want to destroy everyone who'd ever made her feel less than extraordinary. "I want to marry you," and he said clearly, "because I cannot imagine a life without discussing poetry over breakfast, debating philosophy over dinner, and spending every evening with someone who refuses to perform. I want to marry you because you're the only person in London who makes me want to rejoin the world. I want to marry you because you're exactly enough, exactly as you are." "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, with growing certainty, "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Julian pulled her close and kissed her in the center of Lady Westmont's ballroom, in front of 500 witnesses who would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. When he finally released her, he turned to address the stunned crowd. If you've been fortunate enough to truly know her, you understand my choice. If you haven't, that's your profound misfortune. The ballroom remained frozen in stunned silence for 3 heartbeats. Then, like a dam breaking, sound rushed back. Gasps, whispers, the rustle of fans moving faster as matrons processed what they just witnessed. Julian kept Penelope's hand firmly in his as it turned them both to face the crowd. He wanted everyone to see her face, tear-stained but radiant, no longer hiding, no longer apologizing for existing. "Let them stare," he murmured into her ear. "I want everyone to see exactly who I'm choosing and why." Lady Bloomville pushed through the crowd first, her face a complicated mixture of shock, calculation, and something that might have been guilt. "Penelope, my lord, this is unexpected. Only if you haven't been paying attention, Lady Bloomville." Julian's tone was pleasant, but his meaning was clear. "Your daughter is extraordinary. I'm simply the first person with the sense to say so publicly." Across the room, Lucinda stood completely still, her perfect composure finally shattered. She looked smaller somehow, as if Julian's words on the terrace had physically diminished her. For the first time in her life, she was watching someone else receive the attention, the admiration, the triumph, and understanding that she'd thrown it away with both hands. Other women began approaching, not with mockery now, but with reassessment. Miss Caroline Hartwell, who 3 weeks ago had laughed at Lucinda's mockery, now smiled with what looked like genuine warmth. "Miss Bloomville, I hope we might call on you. I've been reading the Wordsworth you mentioned, and I'd love to discuss your thoughts." Mrs. Henderson, hostess of the literary salon, beamed. "The future Countess of Thornfield. My dear, you must promise to continue attending our discussions." One by one they came, the same women who dismissed her, excluded her, treated her intelligence as social liability. Now they wanted proximity to the woman the Earl had chosen, wanted to claim they had always seen her value, wanted to rewrite their own histories. Penelope watched this reversal with clear eyes, no longer desperate for their approval. She'd learned something crucial in the past weeks. Their opinions were weather vanes, spinning with whoever held power. They hadn't been right when they mocked her. They weren't right now in praising her. They were simply performing, as they always had. The only opinion that mattered stood beside her, his hand warm and steady in hers. Julian guided her toward the ballroom exit, moving slowly so everyone could see them, see his choice, see her acceptance. At the doorway, he paused and turned back one final time. "My fiancé and I will be hosting a dinner next month for people who appreciate intelligent conversation over empty performance. Invitations will be selective." His gaze swept the crowd, lingering briefly on Lucinda. "Very selective." Then they were through the doors into the cooler air of the entrance hall, leaving behind the whispers and the stares and the frantic social recalculations. "You know they'll talk about this for months," Penelope said, still dazed. "Good. Let them talk about the Earl who chose substance over performance. Let them talk about the woman who was always remarkable, even when they were too shallow to notice." He lifted her hand to his lips. "You spent 21 years being told nobody liked you. It took one person actually seeing you to show the world what they'd missed." "You didn't just see me," Penelope said softly. "You made me visible." "No, my love. You were always visible. I simply refused to let them make you invisible anymore." They walked into the London night together, the reclusive Earl and the family embarrassment. Now the season's most celebrated engagement. Not because Penelope had changed, but because someone with power had used it to show everyone what had always been there. The future Countess of Thornfield would never apologize for being herself again. Did Julian's public proposal leave you breathless? This is just the beginning of Penelope's transformation from family embarrassment to society's most celebrated woman. Subscribe now for more stories of underdogs finding their power, of authenticity triumphing over performance, and of one person's belief changing everything. Because everyone deserves someone who sees their worth and refuses to let the world ignore it. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next tale of vindication and love.
If you enjoyed this story, we appreciate you a whole lot and look forward to connecting with you as we build a community on this channel. Every day, we will put out more stories, so we need your support. Help us by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. You won't miss any new exciting videos. Check out the next video. You'll love it!